There's a kind of man who walks into a room, and the room rearranges itself around him, without anyone saying a word. And Knox Barrett had been that man for so long. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be nobody, until the steel door of Halloran Federal slammed behind him, and a guard called out fresh fish, like he was something to be gutted. He didn't correct anyone. That was the whole point. 3 years ago, the men who ran the docks 2 states over moved cargo, money, and lives on a single phone call from Knox, a tall man in his late 30s with a tailor's posture, gray at the temples, and eyes the color of cold harbor water that never seemed to blink when other men flinched. They called him the Quiet Man, and the quiet wasn't weakness, it was the sound a blade makes before it's drawn, but nobody at Halloran knew that. To them, he was just a lean new arrival with steady hands and a flat stare, and that's exactly how he wanted it. Here's the thing that doesn't add up, the thing that should make you lean in. A man like Knox has lawyers who eat prosecutors for breakfast. A man like Knox doesn't go to prison, he makes prison happen to other people. So why was he here? Wearing gray, eating off a tray, swallowing insults in a yard full of men who'd never survive a week in his world? He knew the answer. Nobody else did, and he intended to keep it that way. On his first morning in the yard, before anyone could start asking the right questions, a problem found him. Rance Dolan ran D-Block the way a small dictator runs a poor country. 240 pounds of appetite and cruelty, who liked breaking new men for sport, who read a bowed head as fear and fear as currency. Dolan crossed the yard slow, 2 shadows trailing him, and he slapped Knox across the face for the simple joy of watching a stranger crumble. The crack echoed off the concrete. 50 men went silent, and Knox, who could have emptied that yard with a sentence to the right people, let his head turn slow, let his right hand curl closed beneath his sleeve, then let it open again, because whatever had brought him here mattered more than his pride, and throwing one punch could burn the whole thing down. Not yet. What Dolan didn't know, what none of them knew, was that he'd just put his hand on a king and mistaken him for a pawn. But there was one person who saw it differently. At the edge of the yard, mop in hand, invisible the way the overlooked always are, a 27-year-old woman named Adeline Voss watched that closed fist and understood exactly what it meant. She worked the night shifts nobody wanted, scrubbing floors in a place full of men who talked about crimes right in front of her like she was furniture, because a widow drowning in her little sister's dialysis bills can't afford to be proud. She was the only soul in Halloran who looked at the quiet man and saw a quiet man, and that single act of seeing was about to pull her into something far more dangerous and far more redemptive than either of them could have imagined. If you've ever been underestimated, written off, looked straight through like you weren't even in the room, then do me a favor, hit that like button so more people find this story, share it with someone who's quietly holding a line nobody sees, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now let's get back to that prison yard, where a king is pretending to be nobody, hiding a reason no one's guessed yet, and a forgotten woman is the only one watching closely enough to find it. By 11 o'clock at night, Halloran Federal Prison became an entirely different creature from the one it was by day, and Adeline Voss knew it better than anyone who signed their name at the duty desk outside the gate. During the day, the place was loud. People shouted. People laughed. People performed for one another. But when the corridor lights shifted into night mode, when that murky yellow glow stained every wall the color of cold tea, Halloran took off its mask and revealed the true bones underneath. Addie pushed the floor-mopping cart down the corridor of Block D, its wheels squeaking in a steady rhythm she knew by heart, and the sharp smell of bleach rose into her nose, the smell of a false kind of cleanliness, spread over something that could never really be clean. She'd smelled it so often that it clung to her hair, to her skin, even to the short daytime sleeps she managed to steal. The floor beneath her feet shone under the lights, and she mopped each tile slowly, not because she was hard-working, but because moving slowly was the only way to survive an 8-hour shift without collapsing. The cell doors on both sides were shut tight. Behind each one was a man either sleeping or pretending to sleep, and now and then a dry cough echoed out. A body shifted on a bunk, or an unclear murmur drifted through the bars. Halloran at night was a chorus of small sounds, and Addie had learned to listen to them the way other people listened to the weather. The first thing she'd learned, from the very first week she pushed a mop cart through these corridors, was that she was invisible. Not in a figurative sense. In a literal one. People looked through her as though she were a pane of glass. At the bend near the duty room, 2 guards leaned against the wall and talked, and when she pushed the cart past them, They didn't lower their voices, didn't glance over, didn't pause for even half a second. One was telling the other about some shipment that would come in during the morning shift, about who would look the other way, about where the cut would be left, and both of them spoke of those things in the calm tone of men discussing a ball game. Addie lowered her head, wrung out the mop, and kept pushing. She'd understood long ago that to the men in this building, a woman holding a mop wasn't a person with ears, with memory, with the ability to repeat what she'd heard. She was part of the facility itself, no different from the vending machine in the corner of the hallway or the flickering bulb overhead, and because of that, she heard everything. She knew the names of the men who truly ran Block D, not the names printed on the assignment board, but the names people whispered. She knew when a camera in some corner suddenly turned the other way, and she knew that it wasn't because of a technical malfunction. She knew about the small goods that changed hands in the dark, the thin envelopes hastily slipped into uniform pockets, the exchanges that took place right in front of her as though she didn't exist. There were nights when the burden of knowing pressed so heavily on her chest that she had to stop, lean against the handle of the cart, and draw in a long breath of bleach until the dizziness passed. Because knowing too much in a place like Halloran wasn't power, it was a weight. She had no one to tell, and telling wouldn't do any good anyway, because the only people who could do something were the very people she'd have to accuse, so she did what all invisible people did. She mopped the floors. She lowered her head. She kept what she saw locked away in some sealed compartment inside her, along with all the other things she didn't allow herself to think about while she was working. That night, when she pushed the cart to the end of the Block D corridor and stopped before the door that led out to the yard, she caught herself thinking about that morning, about the sound of the slap ringing out against the concrete, about the way the new inmate had turned his head away so slowly. Most people in the yard that day had seen a weak man choosing to endure it. Addie hadn't. She'd seen something else, something she still couldn't give a name to, and all through that long, endless night shift, the image of his hand closing and then opening kept returning to her mind like a question that wouldn't let go. She mopped the last tile, turned off one row of lights according to night shift protocol, and stood for a while in the dim glow that remained, listening to Halloran breathe around her, wondering why, out of all the secrets she carried, the secret of that silent man was the one that wouldn't let her sleep. The night shift ended at 7 o'clock in the morning, and when Addie drove her old car out of Halloran's parking lot, the sun had risen high enough to shine straight into her eyes through the cracked windshield she didn't have the money to replace. She didn't go home to sleep right away. She drove straight to the dialysis center half an hour away, because that morning was Margot's session, and for 3 years now, on every morning Margot had treatment, Addie had been there, even when her eyelids felt heavy as stones and her whole body was worn out like a rag wrung completely dry. Margot was only 19 years old. The girl should have been in her second year of college. Should have been worrying about exams and boys and all the things 19-year-old girls were supposed to worry about, not lying in a gray reclining chair with a bloodline running out of her arm and returning after being cleaned by a machine. Her kidneys had failed when she was 16 because of an autoimmune disease no one in their family had ever heard of before, and from that day on, the lives of the two sisters had revolved around that 3 times a week schedule, like 2 planets circling a cold sun. Addie sat beside her, holding the hand without the tube in it, and told her some aimless little story about a stray cat she'd seen outside the parking lot, making up a few extra details to get the girl to laugh, because Margot's laughter was the only thing left that made Addie feel as though she hadn't completely failed. 3 years earlier, everything had been different. 3 years earlier, Addie had a husband named Daniel, a large, gentle man who worked as a scaffold builder for a construction company in the city, a man who always came home with cement dust in his hair and a corny joke on his lips. Then, one October afternoon, a scaffold beam on the 6th floor, installed the wrong way by someone who wasn't Daniel, came crashing down, and someone called her from the hospital, and by the time she got there was nothing left she could say in time. The construction company blamed the subcontractor blamed the insurance company, and the insurance company found some line of small print in the contract to prove that Daniel's death had fallen exactly into the gap they didn't have to pay for. Addie hired a lawyer with the last money in her account, and after 6 months, that lawyer advised her to accept a settlement so small it felt humiliating. Because, as he put it, fighting an insurance company was like fighting the ocean, and people didn't beat the ocean. She took that money, paid off the lawyer, and realized she had exactly nothing left. With a younger sister who needed dialysis, and a rental apartment whose monthly rent arrived as steadily as the tide. Margot's health insurance covered part of it, but only part. And the rest, the portion the bills kept sending in with numbers that made her heart clench. That portion was the reason Addie took the job at Halloran, because the night shift paid more than the day shift, because no one else wanted to mop floors inside a federal prison at 3 o'clock in the morning, so they paid an extra differential, and that differential, along with the weekend shifts she could pick up, was almost enough to keep the girl alive and keep the two of them from being thrown into the street. She didn't tell anyone this. She didn't complain. She didn't beg. There was a quiet dignity in the way she carried it all, a wordless pride she held tight like the last scarf in a winter with no warm coat. She didn't allow herself to cry in front of Margot. She saved those tears for the drive home, for the few brief minutes in the car parked outside their building, when she rested her forehead against the steering wheel and let 3 years of exhaustion spill out a little, just enough so it wouldn't kill her, then dried her face and walked up the stairs with a smile already prepared. That morning was no different. When the machine beeped to signal that the dialysis session was over, Addie helped her sister to her feet, wrapped the worn coat around the girl's shoulders, and as she guided her out to the car, she caught herself thinking again about Halloran, about the corridor in Block D, about all the secrets she carried inside her that no one knew. She'd grown so used to being invisible that she had almost begun to believe it was her fate. But there was one thing she didn't yet know, and that was that in the place where she worked, another man was also choosing to become invisible, and the invisibility of those two people was about to collide in a way neither she nor he could possibly see coming. Rance Dolan had been in Halloran so long that he no longer thought of the place as a prison, but as his property. At 43 years old, with a large body that had begun to sag in places that had once been muscle but was still strong enough to make people move aside when he passed, Dolan ruled Block D by a logic so simple it was chilling. Everything in that block had a price, and he was the only one allowed to set it. A new inmate who wanted peace had to pay. Men paid with commissary items, with phone minutes, with money their families sent into their accounts, and when they had nothing left to pay with, they paid with submission, by lowering their heads every time Dolan walked past, by giving up space, giving up the better portion of food, giving up even the right to look him straight in the eye. It wasn't disorganized cruelty. It was a system, and Dolan ran it with the patience of a tax collector. What kept that system running smoothly wasn't Dolan's fist, but a man in uniform named Grady Mullen. Mullen was the correctional officer assigned to the floor of Block D, a man in his 40s with a tired face and a habit of always appearing at the far end of the corridor exactly when someone needed him to be at this end. There had never been any conversation between Dolan and Mullen that could be called an agreement. They didn't need one. When Dolan collected tribute, Mullen found a reason to inspect another area. When a camera in some corner should have recorded something, that camera suddenly needed its lens cleaned, or suffered some mysterious technical malfunction that lasted exactly as long as necessary. In return, Dolan kept Block D quiet, and a quiet block was a block where Mullen could write clean reports, saying everything was fine. It was a perfect symbiosis between greed and laziness, lubricated by thin envelopes and small nods, and it had run so smoothly for so many years that both men believed it would run forever. So when the new inmate appeared in the yard that morning, Dolan read him exactly the way he'd read hundreds of men before him. He saw a tall, thin, silent man, with lowered eyes and a face that showed nothing. To Dolan, silence had only one meaning. It was fear that hadn't yet found its voice. He'd witnessed it too many times. That moment when a person realized where he was and shrank inward, and he believed this new inmate was shrinking the same way, only better at hiding it. The way the man turned his head away so slowly after the slap, the way he didn't say a word, all of it, through Dolan's eyes, was the sign of someone trying to preserve his dignity while already shattered inside. And a man like that, in Dolan's experience, was the easiest kind to break, because he didn't fight back at once. He simply endured, and endurance could be worn down day by day until nothing remained. Dolan liked prey like that. He lay on his bunk that night and planned, not a rushed plan, but a patient one, measured and rhythmic, because he understood that breaking a person wasn't something done in a day, but a process, and that process was the part he enjoyed. He would start with small things. He would take things away little by little, comfort, self-respect, the feeling of safety, until the new inmate knelt not because he was forced to, but because he had forgotten he'd ever been able to stand upright. Dolan had done this many times and had never failed. He had no idea that this time, the man he intended to break was lying a few cells away, fully awake, quietly memorizing his name, memorizing Mullen's face, memorizing every camera angle that turned away at exactly the right moment, and placing all of it somewhere inside his mind, with the calm of a man taking inventory, not the fear of a man afraid. Dolan's plan began at lunch the next day, and it began exactly the way he liked it, which meant in front of as many people as possible. Halloran's dining hall was a long room with rows of metal tables bolted to the floor, where nearly 200 human beings ate at the same time, beneath a cold white light that left no shadow for anyone to hide in. And in that place there existed an unwritten system of rules about where to sit, where to look, and who was allowed to pass in front of whom. Knox had observed those rules in silence through several meals, and chosen a place for himself in the far corner, his back to the wall, his food tray set neatly in front of him. He had almost finished eating, when the whole room suddenly changed the rhythm of its breathing. Forks and knives came to a halt. Conversations died down as though someone had turned down the volume on a radio. Knox didn't need to raise his head to know Dolan was coming, because he'd learned that in a room like this, silence moved ahead of the person who created it. Dolan stopped beside him, two of his men hanging back half a step behind him like two trained shadows, and he looked down at the tray with a smile already spread across his mouth. He didn't say anything about the seat. He didn't make up any excuse, because to Dolan, making excuses was for men who still needed reasons, and he didn't. He simply reached out one broad hand and flipped the tray over. Food spilled everywhere. The grayish stew slid to the edge of the table and dropped to the floor. The milk carton popped open and rolled away, leaving a white smear across the concrete, and the sound of the metal tray striking the ground rang through the silent room like a bell. A few small laughs rose somewhere nearby, not because anyone thought it was funny, but because laughing was the safest way to prove they stood on the side of power. Dolan folded his arms and looked down. "Clean it up," he said, his voice unhurried, as though he were granting a favor. "You made a mess on the floor." Knox lifted his eyes to him, only for a moment, and in that very brief instant, something flashed in the depths of his gaze and went dark so quickly that no one had time to read it, not even Dolan. Then he stood, not hurried, not trembling, and knelt down. He picked up each piece of food with his hands, gathering it into a neat little pile, then took a few paper napkins and wiped at the white milk spreading slowly toward Dolan's feet. He did all of it without saying a word, with the steady movements of a man who had already decided he was going to survive this. The entire dining hall watched, nearly 200 human beings, and not one person stood up, not one person opened his mouth, because all of them had already done the arithmetic in their heads, and that arithmetic always arrived at the same answer. Standing against Dolan cost too much. In the dining hall doorway, Mullen leaned against the frame, both hands in his pockets, watching the whole thing with the expression of a man looking out a window on a day when nothing of interest was happening. When Dolan glanced toward him, Mullen did the smallest thing one human being could do. He gave a slight nod, and it was that nod, that tiny sign of a complicity that had become habit, that Knox remembered most clearly from that entire lunch. Because while he knelt on the floor, wiping up his own milk, Knox didn't feel humiliated in the way Dolan imagined. His head was lowered, but his eyes were working. He saw the shoes worn by the two men behind Dolan, which kind were issued, and which kind had been smuggled in illegally. He saw a faded tattoo on the wrist of the man standing on the left, a symbol he stored away in memory to compare later. He heard the way Dolan breathed, the way he shifted his weight, which leg he favored, the slight stiffness in his right knee that he unconsciously avoided putting pressure on, the kinds of things only a man who had once taught others how to bring an opponent down would notice. He counted the steps from his table to the door, memorized Mullen's position in relation to the camera angle on the ceiling, the camera that was turned away exactly as he had expected. Every humiliation Dolan threw at him, Knox quietly turned into data, and when he stood and carried the empty tray to the trash, his hands didn't tremble. The man had just handed him a map, and he didn't even know he'd done it. Addie wasn't in the dining hall at lunch that day, but by the night shift she'd heard enough to picture the whole thing, because stories like that traveled through Halloran faster than anything clean ever could. She heard two inmates retell it while waiting for count, their voices threaded with amusement and something almost like relief, because this time the target hadn't been them. And as she pushed her mop cart through the Block D corridor that night, Addie found herself stopping longer than usual in front of the new inmate's cell. He was sitting on the edge of his bunk in the dark, his back straight, both hands resting on his knees, and there was a fresh bruise on his cheekbone that the corridor light reached just enough to reveal. She knew she shouldn't. She knew every rule in this building told her to keep pushing the cart and not get involved, because an invisible person was safe only as long as she remained invisible. But there was something in the way that man sat there, not collapsed, not pitying himself, only quietly enduring in the same way she endured every day, that made her unable to move on. On her mop cart, she always kept a small first aid kit and a few little things she carried for the long nights. And that night, as she passed the food slot at the bottom of his cell door, she bent down as though she were mopping the floor and quietly pushed two things inside: a sealed gauze pad and a small carton of milk she'd saved from her own late-night meal. She did it quickly and cleanly, without looking in, then stood and pushed her cart onward, as though nothing had happened. Knox watched the two small items slide across the floor of his cell, and for a moment he didn't move. It had been a very long time since anyone had done anything for him without calculating what they might get in return, so long that his first reflex was caution, a search for where the trap might be hidden, but there was no trap. There was only a woman holding a mop who had already taken a few steps away, her back turned to him, not waiting for a thank you, not waiting for anything at all. He picked up the milk carton, then the gauze, and for the first time since Halloran's steel door had closed behind him, something in his chest eased a little. The next night, she passed by again, and this time he was standing close to the bars. "Don't do that again," he said, his voice very low, just loud enough for only her to hear. Addie stopped, her hand still resting on the cart handle. She thought he would thank her, but he didn't, and it took her a second to understand that those words were the thank you, spoken in the only way a man like him knew how. "People notice anyone who's kind to me," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers, and in that look there was none of the coldness she had seen when he looked at Dolan, only a warning that carried something almost like concern. She was standing too close to something that could hurt her, and he wanted her to know it. Addie held his gaze longer than she meant to. "I'm invisible," she said, and one corner of her mouth lifted into something nearly resembling a tired smile. "Nobody notices what I do." Knox looked at her for a while, and this time he was the one who didn't understand right away, because the sentence had been spoken too softly for the weight it carried. "I notice," he said. Then he asked her name, not the way a man in prison asked a woman for her name, but the way someone asked because he truly wanted to know. "Adeline," she answered. "People call me Addie." He nodded slowly, as though he were placing that name somewhere safe. "Thank you, Addie," he said, and it was the first time in many months that anyone inside this building had called her by her actual name, instead of by the mop she held in her hands. She pushed her cart onward, her heart beating in a strange rhythm, and for the rest of the night shift, she couldn't stop thinking about the way he had said, "I notice," as though it were the most precious thing anyone had ever given her, and she couldn't understand how a prisoner could make her feel seen for the first time in 3 long years. While Dolan believed he was patiently breaking a man, that man was quietly doing something entirely different. He was redrawing the map of all of Block D from the inside. Knox knew that to understand a place like Halloran, you didn't ask the people in power. You asked the people who had once counted money for that power, and in the exercise yard, he had noticed an old man sitting alone on the highest concrete step, far from every group, with the eyes of someone who could see the numbers hidden beneath the surface of everything. His name was Walter Pike. In his 60s, gaunt, with half-rim glasses always slipping down the bridge of his nose, Pike had once been the accountant for an organization whose name alone was enough to make people lower their voices, and he had come to Halloran because he knew too much about other people's money trails, a crime that in his world was more dangerous than murder. Knox didn't approach him in a hurry. For several days in a row, he sat down at a careful distance from him, saying nothing, only sharing the silence, until Pike himself was the one who spoke first, because intelligent men who had been isolated for too long often craved a conversation worth having more than they craved freedom. "You're not like the others here," Pike said one afternoon, his eyes still on the yard. "You listen more than you talk. Men like you usually come here with a purpose." Knox neither confirmed nor denied it. He only asked a question that made the old man turn his head and look at him for the first time. A question about where the money in Block D went after Dolan collected it. Pike was silent for a long while, weighing him, then began to speak, softly and evenly, in the voice of a man who had spent his whole life reading numbers other people wanted hidden. And what he said, made Knox understand that Halloran was far more complicated than the surface image of a prison with one greedy bully. The tribute Dolan collected, according to Pike, didn't stop in Dolan's pocket. It was only the lowest layer of a funnel. The cash taken from inmates was turned into things that could be moved outside, washed through commissary accounts, through deposits supposedly sent by inmates' families, when in truth there were no families at all, through a network of borrowed names and transactions, small enough that no one would pay attention. Pike had quietly followed that flow for months, not because he intended to do anything with it, but because reading money trails was the only thing that still made his mind feel alive, and what he saw had been enough to make even him shudder. The money trail didn't end with Mullen. It didn't end with anyone inside Halloran's walls. It flowed outward, toward some place, some force on the outside that was using this prison as a money laundering machine, so clean and safe it was almost perfect. Because who would ever think to investigate a handful of loose change from the commissary of a federal prison? "There's someone out there," Pike said, his voice dropping even lower, "and that person is big enough to turn an entire prison block into his pipeline. Dolan is only the valve. Mullen is only the man oiling it." Knox listened to all of it without changing expression. But inside him, every piece was quietly fitting into place in a shape only he could see. He had come to Halloran with the belief that this place was hiding something, and now Pike had just confirmed that his instinct was right, though the old man had no idea what he had just confirmed. Knox asked a few more questions, careful to keep them general enough not to reveal that he was more interested in one specific link than in the money trail itself, and Pike, after so long without anyone willing to listen, answered more than he had meant to. When the whistle sounded to end yard time, Knox stood, thanked the old man with a nod, and carried back into his cell a picture far clearer than the one he had held that morning. Halloran wasn't the small kingdom of a thug. It was a door, and behind that door was a man Knox needed to find. A name he hadn't spoken to anyone, not even Pike. A name that was the real reason he had put on this gray prison uniform and walked through 3 layers of gates to get inside. He lay down on his bunk in the dark, listening to the breathing rhythm of Block D around him, and let that name sound once in his mind, silently, like a promise whose time had not yet come to be spoken aloud. Dolan climbed one step higher in his plan on the 3rd day, and this time he didn't appear in person, because part of the art of breaking a human being was making the victim unable to know where the next blow would come from. Knox returned to his cell after yard time, and knew from the threshold that someone had been inside while he was gone. The thin mattress had been flipped onto the floor. The few belongings he was allowed to keep had been thrown everywhere. The paperback book he'd borrowed from the prison library had been torn loose from its spine, and in the middle of that disorder, lying face down on the concrete floor, was the only photograph he had been able to bring with him into Halloran. He bent down to pick it up, and saw a shoe print stamped across the center of the frame, mud from someone's soul deliberately ground into it, not by accident but with purpose, because that person understood that destroying an object hurt, but destroying something sacred hurt far more deeply. In the photograph were 2 men standing side by side beneath the sun. One of them Knox from a few years earlier, and the other younger, broader in the shoulders, with a wide, unguarded grin, the kind of smile Knox hadn't been able to wear for a long time. That was Eli, his younger brother. Knox lowered himself onto one knee among the scattered things and wiped the mud from the glass with his thumb, slowly, one circle and then another, until his brother's face appeared clearly again beneath the glass, now cracked by one line where that heel had pressed down. He didn't slam his hand against the floor. He didn't shout. He didn't do any of the things the anger roaring inside his chest demanded from him. He only wiped, and wiped, and while he wiped, his mind drifted somewhere else, to an afternoon many years earlier, when Eli was just over 30, standing in the kitchen of the old house the brothers had shared, and laughing at him for making the coffee too strong, to the way the kid had always trusted people more than was safe, to the way he had once said that his big brother looked at everyone as if they were enemies, and then to the day that laughter went silent for good, a day Knox still didn't allow himself to think about in full even now, because thinking about it in full was something he wasn't strong enough to do inside a Halloran cell with a shoe print still marked on the glass. Eli had been gone at 32, and the way the kid had gone was the reason Knox was here, though no one inside this building knew that. He sat like that for a long time as the darkness thickened around him, the photograph held in both hands, and he told his brother what he had told him many times since the day he walked in here, a vow he repeated the way some people counted prayer beads. He wouldn't spill blood inside these walls. Not because the men here didn't deserve it, but because if he acted, even once, even with one justified punch thrown into a face that deserved to be hit, everything he had come here to do would collapse in that very instant. They would transfer him. They would tighten their grip around him. The invisibility he had paid so dearly to earn would disappear, and the man he was looking for would sink back into the darkness where Knox would never be able to reach him again. Eli deserved his patience more than he deserved his hurried revenge, so Knox swallowed the anger down, as he had swallowed it in the dining hall, as he had swallowed it in the yard, and stored it in the same place as everything he was waiting for. He set the mattress back in place, arranged his few belongings again, and stood the photograph upright in the corner of the shelf, facing outward, so that each time he raised his eyes he would see the face for which he had sworn to demand justice. Then he sat down on the edge of the bunk in the dark, his back straight, both hands resting on his knees, in the exact posture Addie had seen, and waited, because waiting was the only weapon he allowed himself to use until the true moment arrived. The call came at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when Addie had managed to sleep for only 2 hours after her night shift, and the voice on the other end of the line belonged to a nurse at the dialysis center, a voice she had heard often enough to recognize even before she was fully awake. Margot had just been taken to the emergency room. That morning's dialysis session hadn't gone the way it usually did. The girl's numbers had dropped to a dangerous level, and the doctor said her kidney was failing faster than they had expected, that from now on she would need dialysis more often, more urgently, and that it was time to speak seriously about a kidney transplant before her body could no longer endure it. Addie sat bolt upright in bed. The phone pressed hard against her ear, and felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She rushed to the hospital with her hair still uncombed and her hands still shaking, and when she found Margot in a bright white room with more wires than usual attached to her body, the girl tried to give her a smile to reassure her, and that brave little smile almost made Addie collapse right there. "I'm okay," Margot said, her voice weak but still trying to joke. "You look like you're about to faint. I'm supposed to be the one lying here." Addie held her sister's hand and laughed along so the girl wouldn't see the terror rising inside her. But within her, a cold calculation had already begun to run, the calculation she feared most in the world. More frequent dialysis meant more costs. A kidney transplant meant a number she didn't even dare say out loud. Margot's insurance would cover part of a part, and the gap left behind, the abyss between the money Addie earned and the money the girl needed in order to live, had just widened into something she couldn't see any road to fill. That night she still went to work, because missing one shift meant losing a differential she couldn't afford to lose, and she pushed the mop cart through the corridor of Block D with a face she believed was calm, unaware of how plainly exhaustion had carved itself into it. She didn't know someone was watching. Grady Mullen had been a correctional officer long enough to read people in much the same way Dolan did, except Mullen was more patient and colder. He had noticed the woman who mopped the floors on the night shift long ago, not because he cared about her, but because noticing people was an occupational habit, and that night he realized something about her had changed. He saw the reddened eyes she thought she had hidden, saw the way her hand tightened around the handle of the cart every time the phone in her pocket vibrated, saw her slip into an empty corridor to answer a call in a choked voice she tried to keep very low. Mullen didn't need to hear every word clearly. He only needed to hear enough pieces to assemble them. One word, hospital. One word, cost. One desperate question about whether there was any way to pay in installments. And when she hung up, leaning against the corridor wall with both hands covering her face for a moment she thought no one had seen, Mullen stood at the far end of the hall in the darkness and smiled a very faint smile, because he had just found what he always looked for in every person he might need someday. He had just found her weakness. He did nothing that night. He didn't approach her, didn't say a word, because Mullen understood that information was like money. Its value lay in knowing when to spend it. He only remembered. He remembered that the invisible woman who mopped Block D had a dying younger sister and a bottomless pit of debt, and that someone in that situation was someone who could be bought or pressured, or both. Addie finished mopping the corridor and headed toward the end of the block, completely unaware that in the few brief seconds when she had exposed her despair, she had stopped being invisible before the most dangerous pair of eyes in the entire building, and that the attention now turned upon her was about to place her before a choice she would never have wanted to face. Mullen waited 3 nights before making his move, long enough for Addie's desperation to ripen further, because he knew ripe fruit was easier to pluck than fruit still green on the branch. He chose the moment when she was alone in the janitorial supply room at the end of the Block D corridor, a place with no cameras and no one passing by at that hour, and he appeared in the doorway so quietly that she startled when she looked up and saw his shadow blocking the exit. He didn't threaten her, at least not in the crude way Dolan did. Mullen leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, folded his arms across his chest, and spoke to her in a voice that was almost kind. The most dangerous voice a man like him could use. He said he knew about her sister. He named the dialysis center, even gave the preliminary figure for the kidney transplant that she hadn't yet dared to look up. And every detail he let fall made the blood in Addie's body turn 1 degree colder, because she understood that he wasn't guessing. He had investigated. Then he came to the part he truly wanted to say. There was money, he told her. Enough money to change everything for the girl. Enough to pay for the transplant. Enough to erase the pit of debt she was sinking into, and that money could reach her sooner than she imagined. In return, he needed only one very small thing. There was a new inmate in Block D, he said. That quiet one Dolan had his eye on. And some people wanted to know more about him. Who he talked to, what he cared about, what he did when he thought no one was watching. You move through Block D every night, he said. You're invisible. No one notices you. You're the perfect pair of eyes. All she had to do was report what she saw. Nothing else. No need to dirty her hands. And the girl would get her kidney. He said all of that casually, as though he were offering to trade one shift for another, then pushed himself away from the doorframe and left, leaving her standing alone among the bottles of bleach and the mops propped in the corner, with an offer now resting on her chest as heavy as a stone. Addie didn't answer him that night. She couldn't. She pushed the cart through the rest of the corridor like a machine, and inside her, a war had broken open in which she could find no side to stand on. On one side was Margot, the girl's face in that bright white room, the brave smile Addie didn't know how many more times she would get to see, the bare truth that she could save her sister simply by opening her mouth and repeating the things she had already seen. On the other side was a man who had called her by her right name, who had looked at her and said, "I notice." The only person in this building who had treated her like a human being and not a piece of furniture that could walk. What was so wrong about betraying him, she asked herself, when she didn't even know who he really was, when it was only telling the truth, when the cost of staying silent might be the life of the only sister she had left in the world. But every time she tried to convince herself that it was only a small thing, another voice inside her rose up and asked that if it was such a small thing, why Mullen was willing to pay so much for it, and why she felt sick every time she imagined the look in that man's eyes when he realized she had sold him out. She went home that morning and couldn't sleep. She sat beside Margot's bed while her sister slept, watching the girl's chest rise and fall, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't know whether the quiet dignity she had clung to still meant anything at all. When keeping it might mean losing the only thing that still made her want to keep it. She couldn't decide. She only knew that whichever road she chose, some part of her would die, and she would have to go on living with whatever was left. It took Addie 2 days to find a way out. And that way out didn't lie in choosing between 2 roads, but in realizing that she could walk both at once if she was clever enough and reckless enough. She would say yes to Mullen. She would become the eyes he wanted, but what those eyes reported back would be decided by her, and the man she had been ordered to watch would be the first person to know he was being watched. It was a gamble that could cost her everything, but she had lived long enough in invisibility to understand that sometimes the only weapon of someone who was nothing was the fact that no one expected that person to dare to do anything. That night, she pushed the mop cart to Knox's cell later than usual, when the whole floor had sunk into sleep and Mullen was at the far end of the building. She didn't look inside as she spoke. She kept the posture of someone mopping the floor, her head lowered, her voice so small it was almost only breath. "Someone wants me to watch you," she said. "A guard. He's paying me to report who you talk to, what you care about." Inside the cell, Knox didn't move, but she could feel his attention turn toward her like a current of air shifting direction. She continued, briefly, without explaining why she had come to tell him, instead of simply staying silent and taking the money, because she wasn't sure she could explain it. She only said that she would accept his offer, that she would report, but she would report only harmless things, things she made up or things that meant nothing. And if he wanted people to believe something, he should let her know, and she would deliver exactly that into their ears. Knox was silent for a long while, and in that silence Addie suddenly feared that she had miscalculated, that he would think this was a trap inside another trap. Then he asked her only one question, softly. "Why are you doing this? Why not just take his money?" Addie stopped mopping. She thought of Margot, of the kidney, of all the reasonable reasons she should have betrayed him. And then she said the truest, simplest thing, the thing she herself had only just understood. "Because you called me by my name," she said. "It's been a long time since anyone did that. I can't sell that." In the darkness of the cell, something inside Knox's chest shifted. Something he had sealed shut for a very long time, long before he had ever stepped into Halloran. For years, he had lived in a world where every relationship was a transaction, where loyalty always had a price, and betrayal was only a question of who paid more. And now standing before him was a woman who had been offered the exact price that could save the life of someone she loved, and yet she had chosen to stand with him simply because he had treated her like a human being. He hadn't believed in such a thing for a very long time. He looked at her through the bars, and this time, his eyes were no longer a warning but something else. Something close to gratitude but deeper than that, because he understood better than she did the price she had just been willing to pay. "Then this is what we'll do," he said. And for the first time he used the word "we," a word he hadn't used with anyone since the day Eli died. He showed her how to report in a way that would make Mullen believe her, which details should be true, so the lie carried weight, which details should be wrong, so it would lead him in circles. He taught her how to lie safely, and as she listened, Addie realized that this silent man understood deception far more deeply than any ordinary inmate should. But she didn't ask, because she had things she didn't want to be asked about either. When she pushed the cart onward that night, for the first time in weeks her chest felt lighter, not because the burden had disappeared, but because for the first time she was no longer carrying it alone, and inside the cell behind her, Knox sat in the darkness with the strange feeling that within these 4 hostile walls, he had just gained something he hadn't planned for, and hadn't expected, a true ally. The final piece came to Knox, not through some spectacular investigation, but through something so ordinary it was almost cruel, a labor assignment list posted on the Block D bulletin board that he glanced at on his way out to the yard. Pike had mentioned a name while tracing the money trail, a man newly transferred from another block to work in the commissary warehouse. Someone the old man had noticed because he handled the books far too skillfully for an ordinary inmate, and the name on the list was Aaron Vance. Knox had heard that name 3 times in 2 days, and each time something at the back of his neck had prickled in a way he hadn't yet been able to explain, until that afternoon, when he stood in the yard and saw the man step out of the warehouse building. He was standing about 60 feet away from Knox, tilting his head as he said something to another inmate, and in the moment he tilted his head at that familiar angle, the whole world around Knox seemed to stop dead. He knew that tilt of the head. He had watched it for years in a man who had once sat at the same table with him, a man he had once trusted more than blood, a man who had once stood beside Eli in other photographs Knox had burned to ash. The man named Aaron Vance in Halloran's records wasn't Aaron Vance. He was Silas Crane, 38 years old, with a new name, a different haircut, and a few extra pounds added to blur the old lines of his face, but still Silas. Still the man who had once been Knox's right hand, the man Knox had lifted up from nothing, had taught, had given the keys to an entire empire, and the man who had betrayed all of it. Knox didn't reveal a single expression. He turned his face away with the calm of a man who had merely seen a cloud drift past and walked toward the concrete steps, but inside him was a silent storm roaring to tear every wall apart. Everything he had come here to do, all the months spent building a false charge so he could be sent to this exact prison, all the restraint before Dolan, the slaps, the overturned tray, the shoe print across his brother's face, all of it had finally led him to this moment, to seeing with his own eyes the truth he had only suspected for so long, that the man who had driven Eli to his death and sold the organization to the feds to save himself was hiding right here, inside the same walls as Knox, under a borrowed name, believing the past would never find him. Because that was the truth no one in Halloran knew. Not Dolan, not Mullen, not even Pike, and certainly not Addie. Knox wasn't an unlucky crime boss caught by the law. He had entered this cage willingly, had chosen to put on the gray uniform and swallow every insult, because this was the only place on Earth where he could get close to Silas before the man had time to run. A free man could vanish overnight, but a prisoner was locked behind 3 layers of gates, with nowhere to go. And Knox had understood that the only way to make certain he caught the fox was to crawl into the pen with it. That night, he sat in his cell with Eli's photograph in his hands, and for the first time since the day he entered Halloran, the vow he had kept repeating carried a new weight. He told his brother that he had found him. He said that now he knew where Silas was, knew where he ate, where he slept, what he feared, and that the hardest part wasn't finding him, but not killing him at once. Because killing Silas would be too easy and too quick, and a quick death wasn't what Eli deserved to have claimed for him. Knox hadn't come here to take revenge in one hot-blooded moment, and then end everything himself. He had come to drag the whole truth into the light, so that Silas wouldn't merely die, but would be exposed, stripped of the false name, the hiding place, the illusion of safety he had built with Eli's blood. So he tightened his grip on the photograph, closed his eyes, and repeated the vow once more in the dark, that he would be patient a little longer, that he wouldn't spill blood inside these walls, that he would do this the right way even though every cell in his body was screaming for him to do the opposite. What Knox hadn't accounted for was that Silas also had the instincts of a hunted animal, sharpened over many years of living under a name that wasn't his own, and those instincts had begun to whisper from the day a new inmate was transferred into Block D. Silas hadn't recognized Knox, not at once, because the gray prison uniform, the silver threaded through his hair, and the deliberate silence had done their work well, but there was something about the newly arrived man that unsettled him. He had lived too long with the fear of being found out to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of his neck whenever the quiet inmate's gaze brushed past him in the yard, a gaze he never caught directly but always felt, like feeling a cold current of air without seeing any open window. An ordinary inmate looked at others in one of several ways, curious, wary, or indifferent. This man looked in another way. He looked as though he were measuring, as though he already knew the answer, and was only confirming it. And Silas, who had spent his whole career learning how to read people under the command of a master at that very thing, recognized that kind of look, because it was the exact look his old teacher had once had. He pushed the thought away because it was too insane to believe, because the man that thought called to mind had no reason to appear in a federal prison, because a man like that would never allow himself to be locked up, and Silas had used that logic to reassure himself for several nights. But fear doesn't obey logic. It kept smoldering, and a man like Silas never sat still and waited for his fear to disappear on its own. He dealt with it in the only way he knew, by turning suspicion into action before it could become dangerous. He couldn't touch the new inmate himself without exposing himself. He couldn't ask questions openly, without drawing the attention he had spent years avoiding. So he did what clever cowards always do. He found a knife already close at hand, and began sharpening it toward his target. That knife was Dolan. Silas approached Dolan carefully, not like a man asking for a favor, but like a man sharing a common concern, and he knew exactly where to press, because he had watched Dolan long enough to understand what fuel burned inside that bully. He began dropping hints. "That new inmate isn't normal," he told Dolan in a corner of the yard, his voice pitched just low enough to sound like a friendly warning. "A guy who takes that many hits and whose eyes don't truly go down isn't weak. He's waiting." He reminded Dolan that the most dangerous men in prison weren't the ones who shouted, but the ones who stayed silent and calculated, that a person who endured too well was usually a person who had something worth enduring for, and that if it were him, he wouldn't let an unknown like that sit too comfortably in his block for long. Silas never once said the word kill. He was too smart for that. He only planted seeds, one by one, in the already fertile soil of Dolan's pride and insecurity, and he let Dolan water them himself. Because Dolan, though no one dared say it aloud, had already begun to feel irritated. The new inmate had endured everything Dolan threw at him without breaking, and prey that refused to break was a quiet humiliation to a predator accustomed to breaking people on schedule. Silas's words didn't create that irritation. They only gave it a name, only showed Dolan that his anger had a basis, that he had a legitimate reason to escalate. And so two dangerous currents that had once moved separately inside Halloran began to twist around each other, the wounded pride of a prison bully and the fear of exposure in a traitor, both flowing toward a single man sitting quietly in his cell, patiently waiting for his moment, not yet knowing that someone else was about to force that moment to arrive sooner than he wanted. In the nights that followed, while those two dangerous currents silently twisted around him in ways he had not yet fully seen, Knox found a strange quiet he had never planned for, and that quiet took the shape of brief conversations with the woman who pushed the mop cart through Block D every night. They never spoke for long, because speaking too long was dangerous for both of them, but they had learned how to press many things into few words, how to exchange an entire thought in the span of time it took her to mop one tile in front of his cell. Addie told him about Margot without meaning to, small fragments slipping out of her on nights when she was too tired to hold them back. About the 19-year-old sister who should have been in college, about the disease that had stolen the girl's youth, about the way she had stopped praying long ago, because praying again and again with no answer made a person tired too. And Knox, who had not told anyone anything true about himself in years, found himself listening in a way he thought he had lost the ability to do. Not listening to gather information the way he did with everyone else, but listening because he truly wanted to know how heavy her burden was. One night, when she mentioned losing someone, he let one piece of himself slip free. He said he understood what it felt like to lose someone he should have been able to protect, what it felt like to keep living with the question of what if, and Addie stopped mopping, looked at him through the bars in the corridor's murky yellow light, and realized that this man was carrying a wound no smaller than her own. "Brother?" she asked softly, not quite as a question. Knox didn't answer in words. He only looked toward the photograph standing on the shelf, and that look said more than any sentence could have. In that moment, something tightened between them. A dangerous closeness, born from the very wounds they both kept hidden, and Addie felt it the way one feels warmth coming from a fire one knows one shouldn't move closer to. She hadn't felt seen by a man since the day Daniel died, and now, in the darkest place she had ever worked, a prisoner whose real name she didn't know, whose past she didn't know, whose reason for being here she didn't know, was looking at her in a way that made her remember she was still a human being, and not only a machine built to endure. And Knox, for his part, felt a temptation he recognized at once as more dangerous than any knife in Halloran. He nearly told her. There was one night when he stood close to the bars, and the truths about who he was, why he was here, what he was searching for, rose all the way to his throat, because for the first time in years he longed for someone to see the real man beneath the mask he wore. But he swallowed those words at the last moment, not because he didn't trust her, but the opposite, because he had begun to trust her, and that was exactly why he couldn't hand her a truth that could get her killed. He knew what she didn't, that every piece of truth about him she carried inside her was one more piece of danger for her, that if Mullen or the men behind Mullen ever suspected she knew who he truly was, then the invisibility that had protected her would become her death sentence. So he kept silent, and this time that silence wasn't a weapon, but a sacrifice, the only form of care a man like him knew how to give, which was to keep the person he cared about far away from the world still clinging to his heels. "Go home to your sister," he said softly at the end of that night, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. "Don't stay here any longer than you have to." Addie nodded, pushed the cart away, and both of them carried into the rest of the night the feeling of standing at the edge of something circumstance would not allow them to cross, unaware that they would not have many quiet nights like this left, because the storm Silas and Dolan were shaping was close now, waiting only for a spark. The spark came on a Thursday afternoon, disguised as an ordinary work order. One of Dolan's men told Knox he had been assigned to take laundry down to the laundry room in the basement of Block D, a dull task no one paid attention to, and Knox understood at once that it wasn't a task. He knew the building's schedule by heart, knew the laundry room would be empty at that hour, knew the only camera angle pointed toward that stairway had been taken offline by Mullen that morning for a familiar technical reason. He knew he was walking into a trap. He went down anyway, because avoiding it would only delay what couldn't be avoided, and because a part of him wanted to know how far Dolan was willing to go. The laundry room was thick with the smell of industrial soap and steam. Heavy-duty washing machines lined the walls in silent rows, and when Knox set the basket down, the iron door behind him closed with a click. Dolan stepped out from between two rows of machines, unhurried, savoring every second. 4 of his men spread out around the room, blocking every way out, 5 men in all counting Dolan, and in Dolan's hand was a phone held up at eye level, the recording light already on. "I want to record this," he said, grinning, "so the whole block can see what it looks like when a stubborn man goes soft." He filmed Knox as though filming a trophy, sweeping the lens across the room so he wouldn't miss a single moment, and that was the mistake he would never fully understand until it was too late. Knox stood still in the middle of the room, both hands still lowered. He looked at each man in turn, measured distance, read posture, and in his mind, his vow to Eli sounded one final time. No blood on his hands, no killing. But self-defense wasn't killing. and 5 men in a locked room left him no choice except to end this quickly. The first man rushed in from the left. Knox didn't step back. He stepped into the strike instead of away from it, shifting his body by the width of a hand so the fist brushed past his ear, and his elbow snapped back into the man's temple, a clean and exact blow that dropped him before he even understood what had happened. The second and third charged him at the same time. He turned, lowered his center of gravity, swept one leg across and took the man on the right off balance, then used that same momentum to drive him into the other one, 2 bodies crashing together and collapsing in a tangle of limbs. Everything happened in silence. No roaring, no wild punches. Only the short, decisive movements of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. A kind of violence so controlled it was chilling, each blow only enough to disable, not destroy. The fourth man pulled a sharpened piece of metal from inside his shirt and lunged. Knox caught his wrist in midair, twisted it at an angle that sent the weapon clattering to the floor, and a knee to the stomach folded the man over with a retch before he dropped. 4 men in less than 20 seconds. Knox was still standing, his breath only slightly faster than normal, and only then did he turn to Dolan. The smile had vanished from Dolan's face. The phone in his hand was still recording, trembling, because he had forgotten it, because in that instant he was no longer the predator but a man who had suddenly realized he had misread everything from the beginning, that the silence he had mistaken for fear was something else entirely, something now moving toward him. Dolan threw the phone aside and charged with all his weight, one swing powerful enough to shatter a jaw. Knox ducked away, letting Dolan's own momentum pull him forward, and it could have ended cleanly right there, if the laundry room floor hadn't been smeared with a puddle of soapy water from a leaking machine. Dolan's foot slipped. His charge turned into an uncontrolled fall, his large body pitching forward along a path no one, not even Knox, had time to stop, and his head struck the protruding metal corner of a washing machine with a dull, heavy sound that echoed through the room as it went suddenly silent. Then Dolan lay motionless on the floor, one temple pressed against the puddle that was slowly turning red, and the laundry room fell into a stillness more terrifying than the sound that had just come before it. Knox stood motionless for one long beat, looking down at the collapsed body of the man who had tormented him for days, and in that moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what he would do. The 4 men lying on the floor, groaning, didn't dare move. Dolan didn't move. His chest didn't rise. The red pool beneath his head spread a little wider, and Knox understood at once what was happening. He wasn't breathing. The impact had knocked him onto that fragile border between life and death, and if no one did anything in the next few minutes, Rance Dolan would die right there on the laundry room floor. There was a voice inside Knox's head, cold and clear, reminding him that this was exactly what he could have wanted. This man had overturned his food tray, had forced him to kneel, had sent someone to step on his brother's face, had driven him into this room to film him being beaten down for entertainment. No one in the world would blame him if he turned his back and walked away, leaving events to take their natural course. An accidental death, a slipped foot, no one could pin it on him. He deserves to die, that voice whispered, and it wasn't entirely wrong. But Knox knelt down. He knelt beside his enemy, rolled him onto his back, tilted his chin up to open the airway, pressed his ear close to the man's mouth to listen, and when he heard nothing, he placed one hand over the other, in the center of Dolan's chest, and began to press, steady and hard, silently counting in his head to a rhythm his body remembered from a training course many years before. He didn't do it because Dolan deserved it. Dolan didn't deserve it, and Knox knew that better than anyone in the room. He did it for an entirely different reason, because he had sworn beside a grave that he wouldn't let this place, this world, turn him into the very thing that had killed his brother. Silas had chosen to let a man die when saving him would have meant risk to himself, and that choice was what Knox hated most in the world, the crime he had gone to the ends of the earth to answer. If he now stood there and watched Dolan die only because keeping him alive was inconvenient, then how was he any different from Silas? True strength, he had understood this long ago in the camera-free rooms of his old world, didn't lie in being able to take a life, but in being able to take it and choosing not to. So he pressed on Dolan's chest, once, twice, 30 times, then breathed air into his lungs, then pressed again, sweat gathering on his forehead, his arms aching, and he didn't stop. Through the narrow gap where the iron door hadn't closed all the way, a pair of eyes was watching. Addie had gone looking for him after hearing a prisoner murmur that something was wrong in the basement, and she had arrived in time to witness not a man taking revenge, but a man kneeling on the floor and fighting to drag life back into the very enemy who had just tried to take his. Her eyes darted to the floor near the doorway, landing on Dolan's discarded phone, which was still humming with its recording light blinking. Knowing she had only seconds, she slipped her hand through the narrow gap, retrieved the device with trembling fingers, and angled its lens toward the scene. Some instinct told her that this moment needed to be preserved, that the truth unfolding before her eyes was so precious and so fragile that if no one recorded it, it would be twisted into something else entirely. Through that narrow gap, the lens in her hands captured everything. The 5 men scattered across the floor, the weapon dropped beside them, and in the center of it all, the silent man forcing beat after beat of life back into his enemy's chest. Then Dolan coughed. A dry, choking cough, and his chest began to rise again beneath Knox's hands. Knox sat back on his heels, breathing hard, looking down at the man who had just been brought back to life by the very hands he had tried to break. And he felt no victory, no relief, only the weary emptiness of a man who had kept a vow, whose cost was heavier than anyone could understand. The phone Dolan had thrown aside was still lying on the laundry room floor, its recording light still on. And that was the first thing Knox picked up after the alarm blared and the guards flooded down into the basement. In the chaos of men being handcuffed and stretchers being brought in, no one noticed an inmate quietly turn off the screen of a phone and hold it close against his body, and no one knew that the phone had just become the final piece in a plan that had been built months before Knox ever walked through Halloran's gates. Because this was the truth that even now no one knew in full. Not Addie, not Pike. Knox hadn't come to Halloran only to find Silas and settle an old blood debt the old way. Months earlier, he had sat across from a federal agent in a windowless room, a woman named Diane Keller, from an organized crime investigation unit that had been tracking the dirty money flowing through prisons for years without ever managing to reach its core. Knox had what Keller needed, inside knowledge of how the underworld operated, and Keller had what Knox needed, a legal path to destroy Silas instead of merely killing him. They had made a deal. Intelligence indicated Silas was hiding inside Halloran under a shadow identity, heavily protected by high-ranking moles within the system, who kept his records untouchable from the outside. The Bureau couldn't extract him without tipping off his powerful backers, who would instantly destroy the paper trail of the massive prison money laundering network. They needed Knox, the only man Silas truly feared, to infiltrate the facility, force the traitor into making a desperate misstep, and locate the physical ledgers hidden within the block's black market. Thus, Knox accepted a staged charge just serious enough to send him into the wolf's den, where he could collect what no agent could gather from a federal desk: undeniable, living evidence of the entire conspiracy from Dolan to the highest tier. That was why he had swallowed every humiliation without fighting back. One punch at the wrong time would have gotten him transferred and ruined everything. He needed time, he needed invisibility, and now, in the phone held in his hand, he had the footage Dolan himself had recorded. Footage showing 5 men ambushing 1 man in a room where the camera had been deliberately shut off. Footage Dolan had meant to use as a trophy, but that had now become evidence against him and proof of Mullen's complicity. Knox found Silas the next morning at the edge of the yard, where he stood alone with the expression of a man who had sensed that the ground beneath his feet was about to give way. This time Knox didn't hide his eyes. He looked straight at him, and he saw the moment Silas finally recognized him, saw the blood drain from the traitor's face as he understood that the posture, the gaze he had tried to convince himself was impossible, was in fact the thing he feared most. "Knox," he breathed, the name nearly soundless. Knox didn't answer at once. He let Silas's true name hang in the air between them like a sentence already passed. "I didn't come here to kill you," he said at last, his voice low and even. "Killing you would be too merciful, and too quick. You let Eli die to save yourself, and then you sold the rest to the feds to buy your own safety, and you thought a false name would be enough to bury all of it." He told Silas that everything he had done had been recorded, that the money trail Pike had quietly followed for months now sat inside the ledgers the old man had given him, that the footage in his hand would bring down both Dolan and Mullen, and that all those pieces were now on their way out to someone who had been waiting for them for a long time. He told Silas that he hadn't been thrown in here. He had chosen to walk in, because of him. And Silas had even sat eating only a few yards away from him for weeks, without knowing that the man hunting him had been right there inside the cage. Silas stepped back once, then again, his eyes darting around for an escape that didn't exist. And for the first time since the day he betrayed everyone who had ever trusted him, he understood that no false name, no wall, no distance, was far enough to outrun a truth that had been patiently built around him day by day, right under his nose, by a man he had been foolish enough to believe he had buried forever. Justice, when it finally began to move, moved faster than anyone in Halloran could react. Dolan's phone, the footage Addie had recorded through the crack in the door, and the ledger pages Walter Pike had quietly kept for months, all passed beyond the prison walls within 48 hours, into the hands of Agent Diane Keller, the woman who had been waiting for exactly those pieces for a long time. And once they lay on a federal desk, the official story Halloran had always told about itself couldn't survive a single day. Rance Dolan woke in the infirmary with one side of his head wrapped in bandages, and soon discovered that the footage he had recorded to show off his victory had become the thing that buried him. He was charged with additional counts of organized assault and conspiracy to cause bodily harm, and the 4 witnesses against him were the very 4 men who had followed him, men who hurried to talk in exchange for leniency, the moment they realized the ship was sinking. The sentence Dolan had thought was nearly finished now stretched many more years ahead of him, and the little kingdom he had ruled for so long fell apart in a single morning, the inmates who had once lowered their heads before him now walking past without bothering to glance his way, and the silence they gave him was crueler than any mockery could have been. Grady Mullen didn't leave quietly, but he still had to leave. The investigation into camera angles that went dark at exactly the right moments, reports that were suspiciously clean, and the illegal phones moving through his floor exposed precisely the pattern Pike had once traced on paper. He was stripped of his badge, charged with falsifying records and aiding criminal activity, and the tiny nod he had once given Dolan through the dining hall doorway, that signal of complicity hardened into habit, finally became the thing that ended his career. Warden Helena Frost, the head of Halloran, the woman who had spent years writing perfect summaries about a facility she knew was rotting from within, submitted her resignation before the board could remove her. The woman who had always hated attention left Halloran under the flash of reporters' cameras camped outside the gate, and an independent state monitor was sent in to take over, tearing through layer after layer of the system no one had dared to touch for years. But the most important collapse, the collapse Knox had traded months of living as a nameless man to bring about, belonged to Silas Crane. Pike's ledger pages didn't merely expose the money being washed through Halloran. They also traced it back to the outside power Silas worked for. And once the federal government pulled that thread, the whole cloth began to come apart. His true identity was exposed. The name Aaron Vance dissolved, and with it went the last disguise hiding what he had done years before. He was charged in connection with Eli Barrett's death, with betraying an entire organization, with the chain of crimes he had believed he had buried forever beneath a false life. They led him out of Halloran in handcuffs to transfer him to a federal trial whose outcome was almost already decided. And when he crossed the yard for the last time, he lifted his eyes to find Knox among the crowd of inmates watching. Knox stood there, silent as always, and he said nothing, offered no triumphant smile, no word at all. He only looked, and in that look Silas read everything he needed to read, that Knox had won without lowering himself to stand on the same level as him, that the justice he had claimed was clean justice, untouched by blood, impossible to overturn, and that was exactly what made it absolute. Eli had been given justice, not through a death in the dark, but through the light, exposing the whole truth. And Knox, standing in the yard where everything had begun with a slap, finally felt the vow he had carried for all that time being set down, gently and completely. A few weeks after Halloran was turned inside out, a call came to the dialysis center with news Addie had stopped allowing herself to dream of, that the entire cost of Margot's treatment, including the kidney transplant, whose number she had never dared to say out loud, had been fully covered by an anonymous fund. She stood in the hospital hallway with the phone pressed to her ear, asking the person on the other end again and again whether there had been some mistake. And when she finally understood that it was true, she leaned back against the wall and slid down to the floor, crying in a way she had not allowed herself to cry for 3 long years. Not from pain, but because for the first time, the weight had been lifted from her shoulders by an invisible hand. She didn't need anyone to tell her whose hand it was. Margot received her kidney transplant on a spring morning. The surgery was successful, and when the girl opened her eyes with color returned to her face after years of grayness, Addie sat beside the bed holding her sister's hand, and understood that her 19-year-old sister had finally been given back the future illness had once stolen from her. Knox was released not long afterward, when the stage charge used to bring him into Halloran was quietly removed according to the agreement with Agent Diane Keller. He walked out through the 3 layers of gates that had once swallowed him, but the man who came out was no longer the crime boss who had gone in. He didn't return to the old empire. He dissolved what remained of it, cut the ties that had bound him to a world that had taken his only brother from him. Because inside those dark walls he had come to understand one thing, that the power he had spent his whole life accumulating had never protected what truly mattered to him. Instead, he did something no one from his old world could have expected. He used his fortune to create a fund, an initiative with a simple name, dedicated to the people society kept looking through. Night shift, janitors, cleaners, people doing invisible work in detention facilities and in places no one wanted to look at. People who worked in the dark and were treated as though they didn't exist. The fund fought for their rights, for their safety, for the basic right to be recognized as human beings, and it pushed for new rules requiring transparency and protection in the very places where invisibility had once been exploited to hide crimes. Walter Pike, released early because of his cooperation with the investigation, was the first person Knox invited to keep the clean books, and for the first time in the old man's life, he did accounting for something he didn't have to hide. As for Addie and Knox, the bond between them didn't end with any loud promise, but with something much quieter and far more enduring. He came to her not as a crime boss seeking out someone who had once helped him, but as a man seeking out the woman who had seen the real him when he was nothing at all, the woman who had chosen to stand beside him when doing so offered her nothing but risk. They began again from the beginning, slowly. 2 people who had once been invisible, now learning how to be seen by someone else. And that was the beginning of something neither of them was in any hurry to name. And perhaps that is exactly what this story wants to leave in each of our hearts. That the worth of a human being doesn't lie in the power they hold, in the position they have, or in the way the world sorts them into those worth noticing and those not worth noticing, but in the innate dignity every person carries, the dignity that deserves to be seen and respected. The most powerful man in this story, and the woman considered the most invisible, turned out to be alike in one essential way. Both longed to be recognized as real human beings, and the moment they gave that to each other changed both of their lives. How many people around us every day are quietly holding a line no one notices? How many serve us, clean up behind us, do the work that makes our lives easier, while we have never once looked them straight in the eye and said thank you? Perhaps the simplest and deepest lesson here is to truly see one another, to treat every person we meet with the respect they deserve, because we never know what lies behind someone's silence, an entire story, a wound, a strength we never imagined. If this story touched your heart, please hit like, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so that every day you can hear more meaningful and compelling stories. We'd love to hear the feelings from deep inside your heart, so please leave a comment and tell us how this story made you feel, and whether in your own life you have ever felt invisible, or ever met someone you wish you had seen more clearly. Thank you for listening all the way to the very last moment. May everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again.